Haskell Creek, Texas, summer 1882. The red dust hadn't even settled before Preston Duval rode 4 horses straight through the gate of Whitaker Ranch. No knock, no warning. Like the land was already his, and he just hadn't bothered to say so out loud yet. Cole Whitaker walked out into the middle of the yard and stopped. He didn't go to meet him, didn't open his mouth. Just stood there, hands loose at his sides, and made Duval ride to him. Duval dismounted. His 3 men stayed up on their horses, hands resting easy near their guns. He straightened his hat, put on a smile so polished it was almost worse than a threat, and spoke in the voice of a man who had spent his whole life getting what he wanted. "I'm prepared to make you an offer that'd be hard to refuse, Whitaker. That spring, it's worth a great deal more to my operation than it'll ever be to yours. No, one word." Flat and cold as the limestone under their boots, Duval's eyes drifted across the yard and stopped on May, standing at the edge of the garden, trowel still in her hand, watching both men without blinking. He looked at her, the way a man looks when he's checking a face against a photograph he's been carrying a long time. Like he'd been searching and had just confirmed what he found. May set the trowel down and walked across the yard. No hurry. She came and stood directly beside Cole, looked straight at Duval, and kept her face like still water. The smile on his lips didn't disappear, but something behind those pale eyes shifted and recalculated. He hadn't planned for her. 30 days, he said, voice still smooth, though the cold underneath it was showing now. After that, the legal situation becomes a great deal more complicated than it needs to be. He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode out with his 3 silent men behind him. The yard went quiet. May watched their dust trail thin out and disappear down the red dirt road. "He wasn't asking about a price," she said quietly. "No," Cole said, eyes still fixed on the gate. This time, he wasn't asking about a price. She turned and looked at him, this man the whole town had warned her not to trust. The man with a locked door at the end of his hallway that nobody had been permitted to ask about in 3 years. He stood there still as the earth itself, solid as the limestone hills behind him. And for the first time since she had stepped off the morning train with $14 and nowhere left to run, May Calloway felt something she hadn't counted on feeling. Like someone was standing next to her. That was the most dangerous thing she'd felt in years, and this was only the beginning. Cole Whitaker woke up before the sun did. He always had. Even as a boy, he'd been like that, eyes open, before the rooster. Feet on the floor before his father called. Some people are built for mornings. Cole was built for the part of morning that comes before morning, the dark, quiet part, the part where nothing's asked of you yet. He dressed without lighting the lamp, pulled on his boots in the hallway, walked through the kitchen, and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot he'd set to brew the night before. 1 cup. That was the rule now, though he hadn't made it consciously. It had simply become true over the past 3 years. 1 cup, 1 chair on the back porch, 1 man watching the sky go from black to gray to the particular shade of orange that crept up, slow and serious, over the limestone hills. He didn't mind the quiet. He'd made his peace with it. His horse, Ranger, stood at the fence line closest to the porch, a black quarter horse, 16 hands, with a white mark on his left foreleg shaped like nothing in particular. Ranger watched Cole the way he always did in the morning, patient, unhurried, like he had nowhere else to be, which was true, and like he preferred it that way, which was also true. 200 miles to the east, a train was running west through the dark. Cole didn't know that. He was watching his fence line. By 6 in the morning, he was out working it. Ray Hollis, his foreman, had come by before sunrise. With the report storm the night before had taken down a section on the west side. 3 head of cattle, loose in the neighboring pasture. Cole had listened, nodded once, finished his coffee, and gone to get Ranger. The fence was an hour's work. Cole did it without complaint, without conversation, without any particular expression on his face. He dug, he set, he wired. His hands were calloused in the specific places that told you this man worked his own land and didn't just give orders about it. Partway through the third post, he found a bird's nest tucked into the hollow of the rotted wood. Small thing. 4 pale eggs inside. Speckled brown. He looked at it for a moment. Then he worked around it, post by post, leaving that section standing. Ray saw it from the fence line. Didn't say a word, but he remembered it later, when he was trying to explain Cole Whitaker to people who thought they already knew who he was. Back at the house by midday, Cole passed the hallway on his way to the kitchen. He always passed the hallway. At the end of it was a door. Plain wood. Nothing special about it except the padlock. He'd put that there himself 3 years ago, on a Tuesday, in February, in the hour after he'd come home from the worst night of his life. He stopped for a second, the way he always did. Then he kept walking. That evening, Eli Wade came in from town with news. Eli was 21 and talked the way young men do when they've been alone on horseback all day and have a lot stored up. Cole let him talk. He was sitting at the kitchen table going through the week's supply ledger. Duval's asking about the ranch again, Eli said. He leaned against the door frame, hat in his hands. Heard it from the feed store clerk. Last time he asked what I'd take for it, Cole said, not looking up. This time, Eli hesitated. This time he wasn't asking about a price. Cole set down his pen. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Sunday morning was different. The ranch was quiet in a particular way on Sundays. The hands who went to church had gone. The ones who didn't were sleeping in. The yard was empty, and the air was still, and the whole property felt like it was resting. Cole carried a stack of primers out to the old tack barn, the one at the back of the property that nobody used anymore. He'd set up a flat piece of board as a chalkboard and nailed it to the wall himself 3 years ago. Around the same time, he'd put the padlock on the hallway door. The children were already there when he arrived. 7 of them, ranging from 6 to 14, sons and daughters of the Mexican families who worked the ranch. They sat on upturned crates and feed sacks and looked at him the way children look at teachers waiting. A little uncertain, hoping today would be the kind of day where something made sense. Cole set the books down, picked up a piece of chalk. All right, he said. Where did we leave off? They worked for an hour. Reading, arithmetic, a little writing. Cole moved between them without impatience. When a boy named Thomas couldn't get his letters to stay in the right direction, Cole sat beside him and showed him again, slow, from the beginning, like it wasn't the 4th time they'd been over it. At the end, the youngest one, a girl named Rosa, just 6, missing her 2 front teeth, raised her hand and asked the question she asked almost every week in some form or another. Mr. Whitaker, why do you teach us? The older kids glanced at each other. They'd heard the question. They were curious about the answer, too. Cole thought about it a moment. He always thought before he spoke. It was one of the things the children had learned about him. Because the only people who can be tricked into signing their name to something harmful, he said, are people who can't read what it says. He looked at Rosa, then at the rest of them. I don't want you to be those people. Rosa nodded seriously, like she was filing that away. Cole picked up the chalk again. Now, back to work. That evening, Ray sat with him on the back porch for a while. Ranch needs someone to run the house side of things, Ray said. He said it the way a man says something he's been holding for a while. Since Mrs. Sarah don't, Cole said. Ray didn't. They sat in the dark. Ranger breathed softly from the barn. Somewhere 200 miles east, a train was still moving west. Cole didn't know that either. He would, by morning. The train pulled into Haskell Creek at 7:30 in the morning. May Calloway was the 3rd person off. She stepped down onto the platform with a small leather bag in one hand and $14 folded into the inside pocket of her coat. The coat was too heavy for June in Texas. She hadn't known that when she packed it. She knew it now. The heat hit her like an open oven door. She stood on the platform and took stock of the town the way her mother had taught her to take stock of any new place, quietly, without letting your face show what you're thinking. Main Street, a feed store, a dry goods, a hotel that needed paint, a sheriff's office with the door propped open. Red dust on everything, the kind of dust that settled into the creases of things and stayed there. 3 men sat in chairs outside the hotel, looking at her. She looked back, brief and neutral, and then looked elsewhere. This was the 3rd time in her life she'd stepped off a train somewhere. No one knew her name. First time was when her mother died, and her aunt took her in 2 counties over. Second time was when she left home at 19 to teach reading in the poor quarter near her family's old street. That time she'd had a plan. This time she had $14 and a general direction. She walked off the platform. The dry goods store was cool inside and smelled like sawdust and coffee and the faint sweetness of dried apples stored in barrels near the back. A young man behind the counter watched her come in with the careful expression of someone who'd been told not to stare, but hadn't quite learned the technique. May set her bag on the floor and asked him plainly whether he knew of anyone in the area looking for household help. He opened his mouth. "Excuse me." The voice came from the far end of the fabric bolts. A woman, mid-30s, brown hair pinned up practical rather than pretty. She was holding a length of blue cotton against her arm, like she was checking the color. She looked at May with the kind of eyes that take quick, accurate measurements of people. "I couldn't help but hear," the woman said. She didn't sound apologetic about it. "Clara Brooks. I've got the property east of Miller Creek. May Calloway." Clara put the fabric down. "Where are you from?" "Far enough that getting back isn't something I'm planning on." Clara considered that for a moment. Most people would have pushed. Clara simply nodded, like far enough was a complete and sufficient answer, and moved on. "There's a ranch about 8 miles south," she said. "Whitaker Ranch. Cole Whitaker runs it cattle, mostly. He's been without anyone to manage the house side since last winter. His foreman's wife used to handle it. She passed in February. Is he a decent man?" Clara paused. Not because she didn't know the answer, because she was deciding how to frame it. "He's honest," she said. "He pays his people fairly. He doesn't mistreat anyone." She folded her hands on the fabric bolt. "He's also not easy. He doesn't talk much. He keeps to himself. And people around here have said some things about him that I don't personally believe, but that you'd probably hear anyway. So, I'd rather you hear the useful version first." May picked up her bag. "What's the useful version?" "That whatever you've heard, the man himself is not what people say he is." Clara met her eyes evenly. "In my experience, the men worth knowing rarely are." May thought about that on the walk back to the platform. She thought about it while she arranged a ride with a wagon driver heading south. She was still thinking about it when the wagon rolled out of town and the red dust rose up behind them. She didn't know if it was good advice or bad advice, but it was honest advice. And honest was the thing she was most short on lately. About 3 miles out of town, they passed a group of riders coming the opposite direction. 4 men on horseback, well mounted. The one in front was broad-shouldered and well-dressed in the specific way of men who want you to notice they can afford to be. He had a wide-brimmed hat and pale eyes that moved over things quickly, like he was always in the middle of an assessment. Those eyes landed on May. She kept her face still. She'd had practice. But something about the way he looked at her sat wrong. It wasn't the look men sometimes gave women, which was something she'd learned to handle. This was different. It was the look of a man who'd been shown a photograph and was now confirming the resemblance, like he was looking for something and had possibly just found it. The riders passed without stopping. May didn't turn around to watch them go. "Who was that?" she asked the wagon driver. The man clicked his tongue at the horses. "Preston Duval runs the biggest operation in the county. Man's got more land than he can use and wants more than he's got." He shrugged away. Men shrug about things they've accepted as a fact. The landscape doesn't come to town much. Must be business. May faced forward and watched the road. She didn't sleep well that night. Later, she wouldn't be able to say exactly why. Just that the pale eyes had followed her further than the man had ridden. Whitaker Ranch was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture in her mind on the wagon ride over something grand and imposing to match the name and the reputation and the general tone of everything Clara had said around it. What she found instead was a working ranch, solid, functional, well built, but showing the specific kind of wear that comes not from neglect, but from having too much to do and not enough people to do it. The kitchen garden was dead. The chicken fence leaned at a discouraged angle. The paint on the kitchen door had given up sometime around the previous summer and hadn't been replaced. Someone was running this place. Nobody was taking care of it. A man came out of the barn as she climbed down from the wagon, 50 or so, weathered face, the posture of someone who'd spent 30 years outdoors and had the back to prove it. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who's seen people come and go often enough that he's stopped getting attached to first impressions. "Help you," he said. "I'm looking for Mr. Whitaker. I heard he might need someone to manage the house. He's out on the south fence. Could be another hour." He studied her for a moment. "Ray Hollis. Foreman. May Calloway." Ray nodded toward the porch. "You can wait inside if you want. Cooler." May didn't sit. She stood in the yard and looked at the garden, looked at the fence, looked at the shutters on the upstairs window that needed rehanging, ran a quiet inventory of a place that had been running on hard work and willpower, while the softer work went undone. She was still in the yard when Cole Whitaker rode through the gate. He was taller than she'd expected, lean, not wide, the kind of build that comes from actual work rather than any particular effort toward it. Trail dust on his coat, mud to the knee. He rode Ranger through the gate, saw her, and pulled up without urgency. He dismounted and looked at her, not the way the man on the road had looked at her, not cataloging or calculating, more like a man looking at something he hadn't planned for and was deciding calmly what to do about it. "Who are you?" he said. "May Calloway. I heard you needed someone to run the house. I didn't advertise. I didn't read advertisements." She nodded toward the kitchen garden. "The dead one." I looked at the ranch. He followed her gaze to the garden, looked at it for a moment, looked back at her. He didn't invite her inside, but he didn't tell her to leave. He handed Ranger's reins to Eli, who had appeared from somewhere around the side of the barn, and he said, "Come in, then." That was it. No pleasantry. No welcome. Just come in. Then, and he walked toward the kitchen door and expected her to follow. She followed. This was going to take some adjusting to. Ray found May on the porch after Cole went to wash up. He stood beside her with his hat in his hands and looked out at the yard with the air of a man doing something he'd decided to do and wasn't second-guessing. "I'll give you one piece of advice," he said, "free of charge." May waited. "Don't ask about the room at the end of the hallway. Don't ask about Mrs. Sarah." He turned the hat once in his hands. "And don't ever let him think you feel sorry for him. He hates pity more than he hates almost anything else in this world." May was quiet for a moment. "What does he hate more than pity?" Ray almost smiled. "Dishonesty." He put his hat back on and went to see about the horses. May stood on the porch and looked at the dead kitchen garden, looked at the leaning fence, looked at the limestone hills going pale gold in the late afternoon light. She had $14 in one bag and no plan beyond this. She thought, "That's been enough before." She went inside. Cole Whitaker sat behind his desk the way men sit when they've decided a conversation is going to be practical rather than personal. Straight-backed, hands flat on the surface, eyes level. May sat across from him without being invited. He noticed that. He didn't say anything about it. "What I need," Cole said, "is someone to manage the house side of the operation. Cooking, household accounts, coordinating meals, and supplies for the hands. There are 7 men on the property full-time." He paused. "There used to be someone who handled all of it. She passed last winter." "I know," May said. "Clara Brooks told me." Cole's expression didn't change much, but something in it shifted slightly, like he'd recalibrated for the fact that she'd done her homework. "Pay is $8 a month, room and board included. You'd have your own room, your own lock on the door. I don't go into your space, and you don't go into mine." "Agreed. I work long days. I eat when the work allows. I don't have regular hours, and I don't give notice for them." "I'd need some notice," May said. "Not for me. For the food. It's practical. I can't cook a proper supper at midnight for a man who was supposed to be in at 7. Cole looked at her. "I can send word through Ray," he said, after a moment. "That works." A pause. Something moved behind his eyes, brief and unreadable. "You're running from something," he said. It wasn't a question. He said it the same way he'd said the part about the hours. Plain, matter of fact. May didn't flinch. "You need someone. I need work. Is that relevant to whether I can do the job?" "It's relevant," Cole said, "if whatever you're running from comes to the gate of this ranch." May held his gaze. "If trouble comes to your gate because of me, I'll tell you before it gets there. That's the best I can give you right now." He was quiet for a few seconds. He was a man who didn't fill silence with noise, which she was starting to understand was simply how he was built, not rudeness. Then he stood up and held out his hand. 3 months, he said. Trial on both sides. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, the way someone shakes hands when they mean it as a contract rather than a courtesy. She went to unpack her bag. She was awake at 4:30 the next morning. The house was dark and quiet, in the particular way of places that have been quiet too long. Not the quiet of rest, but the quiet of absence. May lay still for a moment and listened to it. Then she got up, dressed, and went to the kitchen. The stove was old but functional. The larder had enough to work with. She opened every cabinet in order and took a mental inventory: flour, lard, salt pork, dried beans, a half-wheel of hard cheese, cornmeal, coffee, a jar of sorghum, some dried chiles that had gone a little pale but still had smell to them. Good enough. She moved things around until they made sense to her, which took 20 minutes and would have been faster if anyone had ever organized the shelves with any logic at all. She counted the men she'd seen in the yard the evening before. She cooked for 8 by the time boots sounded in the upstairs hallway. The biscuits were done. The salt pork was sliced and fried. The eggs were scrambled with the dried chiles, and the coffee was fresh. She'd found a jar of last summer's peach preserves in the back of the lowest shelf, nearly hidden, like someone had put it there and then forgotten it existed. She put it on the table. Cole came downstairs and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the table, looked at her, said nothing. He poured himself coffee, sat down, and ate. He was not a man who commented on food. He simply ate it steadily, without distraction, the way he seemed to do most things. Then he reached for a second biscuit. He stayed at the table for 5 minutes after he'd finished. Just sat there with his second cup of coffee, looking out the window at the yard coming to life. Eli crossing to the barn. Ray speaking to someone near the gate. May washed up at the basin and didn't say anything. Later, Ray would tell her that in 3 years, Cole had not once sat at that table after a meal was finished. He always took his coffee back to the desk or back outside. He never just sat. She didn't know that yet, but she noticed the 5 minutes. That afternoon, she went to the kitchen garden. The soil was hard-packed and threaded through with dead root systems from the previous year's planting. She found a hoe in in the lean-to beside the house and started working the first row. Nobody asked her to. Nobody had brought it up. But the garden was there, and it was dead. And she was the one who'd be needing vegetables in 6 weeks. So it seemed like a reasonable use of an afternoon. Eli came around the corner of the house and stopped. He was young, early 20s, dark-eyed, quick to expression in the way of people who hadn't yet learned to hide what they were thinking. He looked at her, hoeing the hard dirt in her work dress, and then looked at the hoe, and then looked back at her. "Ma'am," he said, "that soil's been sitting dry since last fall. It's going to give you trouble." "I can see that," May said, not stopping. "I could get a pickaxe from the thank you." She looked up at him briefly. "But I need to feel what it's like before I know what it needs." He stood there for a moment. Then he walked to the lean-to and came back with the spare shovel and started working the row beside her. No more conversation, no explanation, just working. She appreciated that more than she could have said. They worked until the light started going orange, and by the time they put the tools away, the first 2 rows were turned and ready. May's hands hurt, and her back was telling her several things she already knew. She washed up at the pump and went inside to start supper. It was the most useful she'd felt in months. Wednesday evening, Cole came in at nearly 8 o'clock. May had set supper for 7. When he wasn't in by 1:30, she'd covered the plates and left them on the back of the stove. By the time she heard his boots on the porch steps, the food had been cold for 40 minutes. She put the plate in front of him and sat down with her own. He looked at the food, ate it without comment. Cold pork, cold beans, cold cornbread. He ate all of it. May set down her fork. "If you're going to be later than 7, it would help if you could get word to Ray. Not for me, for the food. I don't know how to time a meal I don't have hours for." Cole looked at her across the table. "I don't report my hours to anyone." "It's not a report," May said. She kept her voice level. Not apologetic, not sharp. Level. "It's practical information, so I can do the job you hired me to do. I can't cook supper at midnight for a man who was supposed to be in at 7. Food costs money and time, and I don't like wasting either one." He held her gaze for a long moment. She didn't fill the silence. "I'll send word through Ray," he said finally. "Thank you." Neither of them said anything else. They finished supper. Cole took his coffee to the office. May washed up. The next evening, Ray came into the kitchen at 6:45 and said Cole would be running late, maybe another hour. Something with the east fence line. He'd eat when he got in. Cole never once mentioned having done it. May never once thanked him for it. But the food was warm when he sat down, and it stayed warm from then on. That, she decided, was how things got worked out between practical people. On Thursday, the letter arrived. Ray brought it in with the rest of the week's mail. A plain envelope from the offices of someone named Preston Duval. Thick paper, good quality. The kind of envelope that announced its own importance. Cole set it on the corner of the desk without opening it. "You're not going to read it," Ray said. "I know what it says." Ray crossed his arms. "Cole, last time he came in with an offer, it was 40% below fair value. Word is this time, I know what it says." Cole said again, "The number doesn't matter." Ray looked at him for a moment. "The number's going to matter to a judge, if it ever comes to that." Cole looked up from the ledger. Something moved behind his eyes, the look of a man who's considered a possibility and doesn't like it. "What makes you think it'll come to that?" Ray chose his words the way a careful man does when he's saying something the other person isn't going to like. "Because Duval's been buying up land south of your property line for 2 years running, and he keeps running into the same problem." He nodded toward the window. "Toward the western edge of the ranch, you could just see from there. Your spring." Cole set down his pen. Outside, the last of the evening light was leaving the hills. May was in the kitchen. Through the open office door, she could hear the quiet of the conversation, not the words. Just the shape of it. 2 men talking about something neither one was easy about. She had learned in Richmond that certain kinds of conversations sounded the same, regardless of what room they were happening in. This one sounded like trouble that had been coming for a while and had finally decided to stop taking its time. That night, past 10 o'clock, May was at the small desk in her room writing a letter. Not to her father. She wasn't ready for that. To an old friend from her teaching days, a woman named Dorothy, who'd covered May's class the winter. She'd had scarlet fever and never once made her feel guilty for it. May wrote that she was alive and well, and somewhere in Texas, and that Dorothy wasn't to worry. She didn't say where. She didn't say why. Some things you kept close until you knew whether it was safe to set them down. She sealed the envelope and blew out the extra candle. Through the window, she could see the yard below, pale in the moonlight. The empty fence line, the dark shape of the barn, the limestone hills beyond, going gray and enormous under the sky. She was halfway to sleep when she heard hoofbeats. She lay still, listening. They came from the direction of the main road, slowed, stopped. She got up and looked out the window. A rider, sitting on horseback at the edge of the road, far enough away to be a shadow, close enough to be deliberate, just sitting there, looking toward the ranch. May watched him. He sat for a long time, long enough that it wasn't passing through, long enough to mean something. Then he turned his horse and rode away, and the sound of hooves faded out into the dark, and the night went quiet again. May stood at the window after he'd gone. She thought about pale eyes doing their quick, cataloging work. She thought about a letter on Cole's desk that he hadn't bothered to open. She thought about the way trouble announces itself, sometimes not loudly, not all at once, but as a shape in the dark at the edge of your property line that sits just long enough for you to know it's been there. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep right away. May had a habit of waking before she meant to. She'd had it her whole life. Some internal clock that didn't trust the morning to arrive without supervision. Most of the time she lay still for a while, let her eyes adjust, sorted through whatever the day ahead was going to ask of her. The second Sunday at Whitaker Ranch, she woke at 5 and heard something. Footsteps, the back door, the soft close of it. Careful not to wake anyone, she got up and went to the window. Cole was crossing the yard in the early gray light, and he was carrying books. She watched him go into the old tack barn at the far edge of the property, the one that hadn't housed horses in years. By the look of it, he went inside and pulled the door most of the way shut behind him. May stood at the window for a moment. Then she pulled on her boots and followed. She didn't go in. She stopped outside, in the shadow of the doorframe, and looked through the gap between the boards where the wood had shrunk away from itself over the years. 7 children. They were sitting on upturned crates and old feed sacks, arranged in a rough half circle. The youngest couldn't have been more than 6. The oldest was maybe 14, a boy with serious eyes who was already copying something down on a piece of brown paper. Cole was at the far wall. He'd nailed a flat board up there and chalked the surface white. He was writing a problem on it, numbers, and talking while he wrote. His voice was low and steady. May couldn't make out every word, but she could hear the tone of it. Patient, that was the word. She'd been trying to find the right word for what she was hearing. And that was it. It was the voice of a man who had somewhere to be and was choosing not to be in a hurry. She watched for 20 minutes. At one point, a small girl in the front 6 or 7, with 2 dark braids, got something wrong and looked like she was about to cry about it. Cole crouched down to her level, said something May couldn't hear, and pointed to the paper. The girl looked. Something shifted in her face. She tried again. Got it right. Cole nodded once, the way he nodded when something had been handled correctly, and moved on. May walked back to the kitchen. She started the stove, started the coffee, got the biscuits going, and cut the salt pork, and thought about what she'd seen through the gap in the barn wall. When Cole came in an hour later, she didn't say a word about it. She didn't look at him with anything different than she usually did, which was the look of a woman who was paying attention without making a production of it. She put a plate in front of him, and then she put a second plate of biscuits on the table, more than usual. Enough for a man who'd been up early doing work nobody had asked him to account for. Cole looked at the extra plate. He looked at her. She was already drinking her coffee and looking out the window. He ate. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The afternoon brought a different kind of lesson. May needed to get into town for kitchen supplies, cornmeal, more salt pork, a length of muslin she'd been putting off buying. 8 miles wasn't far in most circumstances. On a horse, she didn't know how to ride properly. It was a different calculation. She asked Ray about the supply wagon. Ray was apologetic. Both wagon horses were out on the south fence with Eli and wouldn't be back before dark. She was welcome to wait until tomorrow. May said she'd figure something out. She went to the barn, found the horse Ray had described as the most patient animal on the property, a dun mare named Pearl, and tried to saddle her. Pearl was patient. May's saddling technique was not. She got the cinch wrong, got it wrong again, and by the third attempt, Pearl had decided that standing still was optional. May was standing in the middle of the barn, talking reasonably to an unreasonable horse, when she heard the door. Cole came in from the far end, saw the situation, and stopped walking. He looked at Pearl. He looked at the saddle. He looked at May. Then he came over, checked the cinch, adjusted the placement, threaded the strap correctly, and had the whole thing sorted in about 30 seconds. He stepped back and stood there. "Thank you," May said. Cole looked at her. "You don't know how to saddle a horse. I know how to saddle a horse. I don't know how to saddle this particular horse." She paused. "Those are different problems." He almost did something with his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something in the neighborhood of one. "You don't know how to ride well enough to go 8 miles alone," he said. "I've been riding since I was 10. "That's not what I said." She looked at him. He looked back. He wasn't being unkind. He was simply stating a fact, the way he stated everything, plainly, without softening it into something easier to hear. "All right," she said. "Fine. What do you suggest?" "I'll teach you. Early morning. Before the day starts. 30 minutes. He picked up his hat from the fence rail where he'd set it. "Starting tomorrow." He walked out. May stood in the barn with Pearl, who had gone back to being patient now that the immediate crisis had passed. She thought about how he'd said it. Not "can I teach you?" or "would you like me to?" Just "I'll teach you," like it was the obvious solution to a practical problem. And the conversation was now over. The strange thing was, it hadn't felt like being ordered around. It had felt like someone looking at what needed doing and deciding to do it. There was a difference. She was starting to understand there were a lot of differences with this man that took some time to see clearly. She was still thinking about it when she went to brush down Pearl and noticed Ranger, Cole's horse, the big black one with the white mark on his foreleg. He was in the far stall, watching her with the kind of focused attention horses have when they've decided you're worth paying attention to. May went still. Ranger walked slowly to the stall rail and put his head over it, toward her. She stayed where she was. She knew enough about horses to know that an animal choosing to come to you was different from an animal letting you come to it. Different thing entirely. She lifted her hand slowly. Ranger stretched his neck and touched his nose to her palm. She stood there and let him. Didn't make a fuss of it. Just let the horse decide she was all right. Because that was how it worked. You couldn't convince them. You could only wait and let them make up their own minds. Eli was in the doorway when she turned around. He had the expression of a man who'd just seen something confirm a theory he'd been working on. He didn't say what the theory was. He just nodded. Slow, like something had been settled. May didn't ask him what he was nodding about. She went back to brushing Pearl, but she remembered the look. And she thought about the fact that Ranger had never, according to Ray, who'd mentioned it in passing, shown that kind of interest in anyone but Cole, she thought. Horses know things, she thought. Maybe people should pay more attention to what horses know. 2 days later, May overheard something she wasn't meant to hear. She was in the kitchen when Eli came looking for Cole. The office window was open to catch the cross breeze. May wasn't trying to listen. She was just there. And the voices carried. Eli's voice first, younger, tighter. The voice of someone trying to hold themselves steady while delivering bad news. He'd broken a rope. Not just any rope, an imported working rope. Cole had ordered in from a supplier in San Antonio, the kind that took weeks to arrive and cost accordingly. Eli had used it wrong during a training session, and it had snapped under the pressure. May kept her hands in the bread dough. Cole's voice came next, low even. Walk me through how it happened. Eli walked him through it. May could hear the nerves underneath the words, the careful way of a young man expecting to be cut loose. Cole listened, didn't interrupt. When Eli finished, there was a pause. All right, Cole said. From here on out, you personally verify every supply order before it goes in. Everyone. And you're going to learn those supply lists until the numbers are automatic. You check in with Ray at the end of every week so we catch any mistakes early. A silence. You're not letting me go, Eli said. You made a mistake, Cole said. Not a habit. There's a difference. Don't let it become one. That was the end of it. May worked the bread dough and stared at the wall in front of her. She thought about every ranch foreman she'd ever heard about growing up. The ones who fired men on the spot for a single bad day. The ones who kept the threat of dismissal hanging over everyone like weather. She'd grown up in a world full of men who thought that power meant keeping other people small enough to be manageable. She thought about what she'd just heard, which was a man offering a 21-year-old a way forward instead of a door. She didn't say anything to Cole that evening, but she stopped working quite so hard at keeping her defenses reinforced. They'd been useful. She just didn't see the same need for them that she had a week ago. The letter was there on Thursday morning. She'd been wiping down the desk in the office. Cole was already out, early, the way he always was, and she moved the stack of unopened correspondence to get to the wood underneath, and the envelope from Duval shifted and showed her what was beneath it. A second envelope, older, already opened, set underneath, like someone had put it there and then put the other things on top and done their best not to look at it. She wasn't trying to read it, but the signature block was right there at the bottom, visible, not requiring any particular effort. Submitted from the office of P. Duval, acting on behalf of Senator G. Holt, Richmond. Virginia May set down the cloth. She read the name twice. Then she set everything back, exactly as she'd found it, the unopened Duval letter on top, the older one, underneath, and went to finish the kitchen. She didn't say anything that day, or the next. She went about her work the way she always did, steady, competent, not giving anything away in her face. She'd had years of practice at that. You learned it early when you grew up in a house where the wrong expression at the wrong moment cost you something. But that night in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Gerald Holt's name on a letter on Cole Whitaker's desk. She'd known it was possible. She'd known it was even probable, if she let herself think clearly about it, rather than hopefully. Holt was not a man who let things go. He was a man who made calls on people, and wrote letters, and used other men as instruments, because that was how men like him operated. They didn't come themselves, not at first. They sent things ahead, she thought. Duval wasn't just after the land, she thought. He was also after me. She put out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the night sounds of the ranch, the horses settling, the wind moving through the cedar breaks, the distant low of cattle somewhere on the south pasture. She thought about $14. She thought about one bag. She thought about what her mother used to say. On the hard days, when the world felt like it was taking things from her faster than she could Replace them. You don't need anyone's permission to exist. May, don't let anyone convince you otherwise. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she would make biscuits and coffee and start the day, and not let any of what she was carrying show in her face. She was good at that. She'd had to get good at it. But she knew, lying there in the dark, that the quiet weeks were probably running out. The riding lesson started Monday. Cole was already at the corral when May came out, which meant he'd been there a while. He had Pearl saddled and waiting, and he handed May the reins with no preamble and said, "Show me what you can do." She could do enough. She wasn't incompetent. She'd ridden horses growing up, in the way that girls in Richmond rode horses on Sunday afternoons, on gentle animals, for recreation rather than necessity. She knew the basics. She knew them the way you know something you've never had to depend on. Cole watched her take Pearl around the corral once. "Your hands are too high," he said. She adjusted her hands. "You're gripping with your knees, like you're afraid she'll leave without you." May relaxed her knees. "Sit back." You're perched on her like a bird. She sat back. He walked her through it, not with impatience, not with praise, just correction. Specific and useful, the way a man teaches when he actually wants you to learn, rather than just wanting to be seen teaching. He didn't repeat himself unnecessarily. When he said a thing and she did it, he moved on. By the end of 30 minutes, she was riding differently. She could feel it. The difference between holding on and being there. On day 3, Pearl spooked at something in the far corner of the corral, a piece of canvas, the wind, caught against the fence post, and May went sideways and then down. She landed on her side in the dirt. It wasn't a bad fall. The ground was soft enough, but she was horizontal, and the sky was where she hadn't expected it. Cole was there before she'd fully stopped moving. He crouched beside her. "Are you hurt?" She took a mental inventory. "Nothing that would matter by tomorrow. Just my pride," she said from the ground. He extended his hand. She took it, and he pulled her up. "Good," he said. She brushed the dirt off her sleeve. "Good that I fell. Good that you're not hurt. Falling's part of it. Everyone falls." He picked up her hat from where it had landed 3 feet away and held it out. "The ones who get back up are the ones who learn." She took the hat. They looked at each other for a second, just a second, and then he went back to the fence rail, and she went back to Pearl. She thought about it later, the way he'd asked before he reached for her, not assuming, not just pulling her up, because that was the obvious thing to do. He'd asked first. It was a small thing. She'd known men her whole life who wouldn't have thought to. The second Sunday came, and May made a decision. She put on her work dress and walked to the old tack barn and knocked on the door. Cole opened it. Behind him, she could see the children settling onto their crates. Rosa, the small one with 2 braids, was arguing quietly with the boy next to her about who had gotten there first. "Can I teach alongside you?" May asked. Cole looked at her. He said, "You understand this isn't something the county would look kindly on if they knew about it." "I understand that. Do you?" "I've understood it since the first year," he said. "Then I don't see why you'd need to ask me." He stepped back from the door and let her in. They worked out a division without discussing it much, which was how things tended to work when 2 people were both practical and both paying attention. Cole handled arithmetic and the writing practice. May took reading comprehension and worked with the younger ones on their letters. Rosa came and sat beside May without being invited and watched her write out the alphabet on a piece of brown paper with the serious interest of someone who had decided this was the most important thing happening in the room, which May thought was probably true. She went through it slowly, letter by letter. Name of each one, sound of each one. Rosa repeated them under her breath, very focused, like she was memorizing a set of directions. Halfway through the 3rd run, Rosa stopped. She pointed to the R. "That's in my name," she said. "It is," May said. "Can you find the others?" Rosa studied the paper. She found the O, found the S, found the A. Her face, when she looked up, was the face of a person who has understood something for the first time. That changes how they see the world. May had been a teacher. She knew that face. She didn't know if there was anything better in the world than that face. Miss May, Rosa said, "Why is it important to know the letters?" May thought about how to answer it in a way a 6-year-old could hold on to. Because the only people who get tricked into agreeing to things that hurt them, she said, are people who can't read what someone has written down. When you can read, you can see for yourself what something says. Nobody can hand you a paper and tell you. It says one thing when it says another. She looked at Rosa. You can protect yourself. That's what reading gives you, the ability to protect yourself. Rosa considered this with great seriousness. Then she nodded and turned back to the paper and found all 4 letters of her name again, in order, pointing to each one. Cole was on the other side of the barn. May didn't think he'd heard. But afterward, when they were walking back to the house and the children had gone in different directions across the yard, he said, without looking at her, "That was a good answer." May said, "It's a true answer." He nodded once. They went inside. It was around this time that May noticed the window latch. The one in her room had been sticking since her first week at the ranch. She'd mentioned it to no one. It wasn't a serious problem the window opened, just required some persuasion. She'd figured she'd fix it herself eventually when she had a spare 20 minutes and a piece of wire. She came back to her room on a Thursday afternoon and tried the latch. It moved clean and easy. She stood there for a moment and looked at it. No note. Nothing said at supper. When she mentioned it to Ray the next morning, sideways, she asked if someone had been in to look at it, and Ray became extremely interested in what he was doing with his coffee cup. "Couldn't say, ma'am," he said. "These old latches sometimes work themselves loose and then back again." That was a complete lie, and they both knew it. That evening, May made butter cake. She'd been saving the good butter for something worth using it on. She cut a slice, put it on a plate, and set it on the small table outside the office door before she went to bed. In the morning, the plate was empty. No note, no mention at breakfast. Cole poured his coffee and went out to the yard as usual. If there was anything different about the way he moved through the morning, May couldn't have pointed to it specifically, but she thought there might have been. And she decided that was how things got communicated between people who weren't much for saying things directly. You fixed a latch. You left a piece of cake. The actual words were beside the point. The storm came in on Wednesday night without much warning. Texas weather, May had learned in her weeks here, didn't feel obligated to announce itself. The afternoon had been hot and still and perfectly ordinary. And by 10 o'clock, the sky was doing something that wasn't ordinary at all. She woke to the sound of it. Heavy rain, close lightning, the particular crack of thunder that meant it was directly overhead rather than somewhere in the distance. And underneath all of that, from the direction of the barn, a different sound, a horse, panicking. She got up. Cole was already in the barn when she got there, which didn't surprise her. He was inside the stall with the young chestnut mare. The one she'd noticed was heavy with foal, the one who'd been increasingly on edge over the past 2 weeks. The horse was throwing herself against the walls, whites showing around her eyes, and Cole was standing in the middle of the stall, with his hand raised and his voice going, not shouting, not commanding, talking. May stood in the barn doorway and watched him. She lifted the lamp she'd brought from the kitchen and held it up so the light reached further into the stall. And she stayed exactly where she was, because she understood instinctively that the last thing he needed right now was more movement, more variable, more anything. The horse was terrified, not just of the storm. May had seen this before in a different context, with different patients, but the same underlying thing. The mare didn't understand what was happening inside her own body. The foal was moving, dropping, and the horse had no frame of reference for it. And the storm was the thing she could blame. Cole's voice went on, low and steady. May still couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. The words weren't really the point. The point was the continuity of it, the sameness, the human sound that said, I'm here. I'm not leaving. Nothing is required of you except to stand. It took close to an hour. Gradually, the mare stopped throwing herself. Gradually, she stood in one place, shaking but standing. Cole moved slowly toward her and got his hand on her neck and stood there with her while the storm worked itself out through the roof. When he finally came out of the stall, he stopped. May was still in the doorway. She hadn't moved. She was still holding the lamp up. Cole looked at her. You've been standing there this whole time. You needed the light. He was soaked through. Shirt plastered to him. Hair dark with rain. He looked at her in a way she was getting used to the long, taking stock kind of look. That mare, May said. She's close. Another week, maybe less. I know. She's not afraid of the storm. She's afraid because something is happening inside her that she can't name. She doesn't know it's normal. She just knows it's not what she's felt before. Cole was quiet for a moment. You've seen that before. In women, May said. Different circumstance. Same fear. He stood there, looking at her, with the rain behind her, and the lamp between them. Then he said, I'll put on coffee. She said, I'll have some. They sat in the kitchen until after 2 in the morning. The storm moved east. The house went quiet around them, the kind of quiet that comes after a lot of noise, fuller than regular quiet. They drank coffee and didn't talk much, and neither of them stood up first. May thought about what she'd watched in that barn. A man spending an hour in the dark, talking to a frightened reason, except that the animal was frightened, and he couldn't leave it alone in that. No audience, no one watching, just doing what needed doing. Because it needed doing, she thought. This is who he is. Not the reputation, not the locked door at the end of the hallway, not the thing the county said about him over dry goods counters and fence lines. This. She went to bed around 2:30 and lay in the dark, listening to the last of the rain on the roof. Across the hall, she heard Cole's door close, and then the house was just quiet. She thought about what Rosa had asked that morning, the question that had landed funny in the room and sent Eli out to the yard in a sudden hurry. Are you and Miss May married? The question had been absurd. She'd known it was absurd. But lying there in the dark, she thought about why it had hit her the way it did, that brief full-stop feeling. Like a stone dropped in still water. She decided not to think about it too hard. Some things were better left to become clear on their own schedule. The letter came Friday. No return address. May's name on the front. In handwriting she didn't recognize careful handwriting. Deliberate, like someone writing it exactly right. Inside 4 words. He knows you're here. She read it twice. Folded it. Walked to the stove and held it over the open firebox until it caught. She stood there until there was nothing left. Then she went back to what she'd been doing. She didn't tell Cole, not because she was hiding it, because she was still deciding what it meant and what to do with it. And she'd learned long ago that the time between learning a thing and acting on a thing was sometimes the most important time of all. You had to sit with it first, let it settle into its proper shape. She stirred the pot on the stove and watched the fire through the iron grate and thought about a man named Gerald Holt, who had never once in his life accepted that a no meant no. She thought, he's coming, she thought. All right, she thought, then I'd better be ready. The chestnut mare went into labor on a Monday night. May heard at first a low, strained sound from the barn that was different from the usual nighttime noises. Different enough to wake her, pull her upright, get her feet on the floor before she'd fully thought about why. She lit the small lamp and went out. Ray wasn't there. He'd ridden over to the Brooks property that afternoon to help Clara with a fence situation and hadn't come back, which meant he'd stayed the night, rather than ride 8 miles in the dark. Cole was in the barn already. crouched beside the mare's stall. When May came through the door, he looked up. "She's early," he said, "and she's presenting wrong." May came closer and looked. The mare was down, sides heaving, and even in the low lamplight May could see the problem. Wrong position. The foal wasn't going to come the way it needed to come without help, and the mare was exhausted already, and the night had barely started. Cole said, "I can try to step back," May said. He looked at her. "I know how to do this. Step back and bring the other lamp closer." A long second. He was a man who didn't hand things over easily, and they both knew it. But he looked at her face and saw something there, not confidence exactly, more like competence, which is steadier than confidence and more reliable. And he stepped back. May rolled up her sleeves. She'd learned from an old midwife in the poor quarter of Richmond named Mrs. Aldred, who had delivered more babies than she could count, and who said the principles were the same, regardless of the species, which May had found to be largely true. You stayed calm. You moved slowly. You worked with what was happening rather than against it. You talked the whole time, low and even, because the sound of a human voice did something to a frightened animal that nothing else quite replicated. May talked to the mare while she worked. She didn't think about what she was saying. She just kept the sound going, steady as water over rocks. Cole stood in the corner with the lamp. He didn't speak. He didn't get in the way. He watched her hands, and he watched her face, and he held the light exactly where she needed it without being asked, moving at once when she shifted position, as if he'd been anticipating the move. It took 40 minutes. When the foal finally came and took its first breath, that particular, shuddering, determined, impossible breath that said, "I'm here. I've arrived. I intend to stay," May sat back on her heels and let herself exhale. She'd been holding a lot of that exhale. The foal was a bay filly, small and dark, and already trying to figure out what her legs were for. The mare turned and began doing what mares do. And May stood up slowly and looked at her hands, and then looked at Cole. He was still in the corner. He'd set the lamp on the stall post. He was looking at the foal, and there was something in his face that was very quiet and very full at the same time. The way faces get when a person is feeling something that doesn't have a simple name. "Good girl," May told the mare, and her voice came out rougher than she'd expected. She cleared her throat. She did most of the work. Cole looked at her. "Where did you learn that?" "A woman named Mrs. Aldred, Richmond. She'd been delivering babies for 40 years. And she said the principles carried over." May wiped her hands on the rag she'd brought from the house. She was right. Cole looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the foal, who had managed to get 2 of her 4 legs sorted out and was working on the other 2. "You should have told me," he said. "You didn't ask." He didn't have an answer for that, which was, May thought, probably answer enough. She found him with the cradle on Thursday morning. She'd gone to the well before the sun was fully up, the way she sometimes did when sleep had been thin, and the early air was the cleanest thing she could think of. The yard was quiet. The barn was quiet. The only movement was a pair of mockingbirds in the cedar at the fence line, arguing about something the way mockingbirds always were. The old tack barn door was standing open. May stopped. She could see Cole from where she was. He was standing just inside the doorway, in the gray early light, holding something, a small wooden cradle, simple, well-made, the kind of thing built by someone who cared about what they were building. He was holding it in both hands and looking at it, and he didn't know she was there. He stood like that for a long time. May didn't move. She barely breathed. Then he carried the cradle inside, set it down, covered it with the canvas tarp, and walked back out into the yard. He didn't look in her direction. He went to the barn, saddled Ranger, and rode out toward the south fence the way he did most mornings. May stood at the well for a while after he was gone. She understood what she'd seen. She didn't need anyone to explain it to her. She'd known about Sarah from what Ray had said, and what the room at the end of the hallway implied, and the 100 small absences she'd noticed in this house, the way it ran, like a machine that was maintained but not loved. The way Cole moved through it, like a man who'd made peace, with only needing very little. A cradle for a child who never lay in it. She drew her water and went back inside. That evening, Cole came in from the south fence and washed up and came to the kitchen. May was at the stove. She'd found a recipe, not a recipe exactly, more like a memory of one, using dried apples and cinnamon and the last of the good butter. Something she'd put together because the pantry suggested it, and her hands knew how to do it, and she hadn't thought much more about it than that. She put the plate on the table. Cole sat down. He looked at the food. He was still for a moment, just a moment. 10 seconds, maybe less, and then he picked up his fork. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did she, much later. Ray would tell her that the dried apple dish was something Sarah used to make on Thursday evenings in the fall, and that Cole hadn't had it since she died. Ray had said it gently, in the careful voice of someone passing along information that matters. May had listened and said, "I didn't know that." Ray had said, "I know you didn't," and that had been the end of it. Sunday morning. The porch. May came downstairs early, not as early as Cole. Nobody came downstairs as early as Cole, and poured her coffee, and went to the back door, and found him already in his chair, looking out at the hills. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She could have gone back inside, made herself busy with something, given him his quiet, the way she always had. Instead, she went and sat in the other chair. He looked at her briefly, didn't say anything. She didn't say anything either. She drank her coffee and looked at the hills going slowly gold in the morning light, the limestone catching it and turning warm, the cedar breaks still dark in the low places. They sat like that for 20 minutes. Then Cole said, not looking at her, "Sarah liked it out here." She said the morning light in this spot was different from any other place in the world. May let the words sit for a moment before she answered. She was right, she said. Another silence. A comfortable one. The kind that only happens between people who have gotten past the stage of feeling like they need to fill the space between them. Cole said, "You've never asked about her." "No, why not?" May considered it honestly. "Because if you wanted to say something about her, you'd say it when you were ready. It wasn't mine to ask for." He turned his head and looked at her then. She was watching the hills. She felt him looking, but she let him do it without making it into something. He was a man who needed to take his time with things, and that was all right. She had time. After a while, he turned back to the hills. She was 26, he said. We'd been married 3 years. She wanted he stopped, started again. She was glad to be here. She liked the land. A pause. She would have been good at this. May didn't say "I'm sorry," because she'd said it once, weeks ago. She'd meant it then, and it was still true now. And saying it again would have made it sound like a habit rather than a truth, she said. It sounds like she knew what mattered. Cole was quiet for a long time. "Yeah," he said finally. She did. The sun came fully over the hills. Ranger moved in the barn. That particular morning sound of a horse, deciding the day had started. Somewhere down by the creek, a pair of meadowlarks were doing what meadowlarks do at dawn. May finished her coffee. Cole finished his. Neither one of them moved to go inside for a while after that. Saturday night, she knocked on the office door. Cole was at the desk with the ledger, the lamp throwing a circle of yellow light over the numbers. He looked up. May came in and sat in the chair across from him without preamble. She'd been turning this over for most of the week, deciding how to say it, and she'd landed on the conclusion that there wasn't a gentle way in, so she'd go directly. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about why I came to Texas." He set his pen down, she told him. Not everything she kept the full shape of her family situation to herself, because some of that wasn't Cole's to carry, but the essential truth of it. a politician in Richmond named Gerald Holt. Her father's debt to him, the arrangement her father had agreed to, without asking her, her refusal, which she'd made plain, and which hadn't been received as the final word she'd intended it to be. The morning she'd left, with $14 in one bag, and the letter she'd written and kept a copy of, and the envelope she'd seen on his desk, Duval's name at the top and Holt's at the bottom. He's not just after your land, she said. He's also looking for me. Duval's running both at once. You have the right to know that, because I told you I'd warn you if trouble was coming to your gate. And it's coming. Cole listened to all of it, without interrupting. His expression didn't change much, but she was getting better at reading the small adjustments in it, the slight stillness that meant he was processing something important rather than something routine. When she finished, he said, "How long have you known his name was on that letter?" 10 days. He nodded slowly. You needed time to decide what to do with it. Yes. Another pause. Then you thought I'd put you out. May looked at him steadily. I thought it was possible. Cole stood up and went to the window. Stood there, looking into the dark yard for a long moment. Whitaker Ranch doesn't put people out because someone else is looking for them, he said. You came here by your own choice. You made an agreement and you've kept it. Where you are is your business. It's not Holt's business, and it's not mine to hand over to him. May was quiet. She'd heard a lot of things in her life, said by men in the direction of women. Some of them had been kind. Some of them had been well-meaning. Not many of them had sounded like that. Like the logic of it was so straightforward, it barely needed saying. Like it was simply true, and that was the end of it. Thank you, she said. He turned from the window and looked at her. Don't thank me for something that shouldn't need saying. She almost smiled at that. Almost. She said goodnight and went to her room. She lay in bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about a man who had given her a room with her own lock on the door before he knew anything about her, who had told her from the first conversation that she could leave whenever she chose, who had just said, without any particular weight to it, that where she was her own business, and nobody else's to decide. She thought about how rare that was. She thought she might have been angrier, for longer, at a world that made it rare, if she didn't happen to be lying in a quiet room. In a quiet house on a piece of Texas limestone, with the sound of wind in the cedar breaks, and two meadowlarks having an argument down by the creek, she closed her eyes. Ray came in late that night with news. May was already in bed and heard the voices through the floor, Ray's and Cole's. Too low to make out, but she heard Cole's chair push back, and the particular silence that followed, a piece of bad news received by a man who doesn't react out loud. In the morning, she asked Ray about it over the breakfast dishes. Ray looked out the kitchen window. Duval bought the Jenkins parcel, he said, the one to the north. Old Ed Jenkins told him 3 times he wasn't interested. Last I heard, he was. Ray picked up his coffee cup. Doesn't look like Ed had much of a choice about it, in the end. May set down the dish she was washing. He's surrounding the property, she said. Ray looked at her. He didn't say yes or no. He didn't have to. May looked out the window at the yard, at the limestone hills beyond, at the long particular light of a Texas summer morning falling over all of it. She thought, so that's how it is. She went back to the dishes. Duval came on a Tuesday, 4 horses through the front gate, mid-afternoon, and the man himself in front well-dressed, unhurried, with the bearing of someone who had spent enough years arriving places unannounced that he'd stopped noticing it might be unwelcome. May was in the kitchen garden when she heard the hooves. She straightened up and looked. Eli had come out of the barn and was standing in the yard with his hand loose at his side, watchful. Ray had materialized from somewhere near the equipment shed. Cole came out of the house. He walked to the middle of the yard and stopped. He didn't go to meet Duval at the gate. He just stood there and waited for Duval to come to him, which Duval did, riding in slow and easy, like a man who owned the land he was riding on. He dismounted. His men stayed on their horses. Whitaker, he said. He had a pleasant voice, the kind of pleasant that was practiced. Duval, Cole's voice was what it always was, level, empty of performance. I'd like to speak with you about the western boundary. Thought it might be better to do it face to face, rather than through letters. We've spoken before. We have, Duval smiled. Not unkindly. That was the thing about him. He didn't seem unkind. He seemed like a man who had decided that what he wanted was reasonable, and that, therefore, any means of getting it was also reasonable. I'm prepared to make you an offer that would be difficult to refuse on practical grounds. The spring is more valuable to my operation than it is to yours. I can compensate you accordingly. No, Cole said. Duval had probably expected that. He tilted his head slightly, the way men do when they're changing angles. His eyes moved to May. She was still in the garden, hands still on the trowel, watching. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the road 3 weeks ago. That catalog look. Then he looked at Cole. I'd prefer to discuss this privately, he said. May set down the trowel and walked across the yard. She didn't hurry. She walked at her regular pace and came to stand beside Cole. And she looked at Duval with the same steady expression she used for most things. Duval smiled again. Miss Calloway, small world. Not particularly, May said. Big enough for a person to find where they belong. Something shifted in Duval's face. Very small. He'd come prepared for Cole, and he'd come prepared for the usual variables. And she was not one of the usual variables. She could see him recalibrating. Cole said, "This is the last time I'll say it." In a friendly tone, "The ranch isn't for sale. The spring isn't for sale. No part of this property at any price. Next time you come out here without an invitation, I won't come out to meet you." Duval looked at him for a moment, then at May, then back at Cole, and whatever pleasantness had been in his face had rearranged itself into something cooler underneath. "You have 30 days, he said, "before the legal situation becomes more complicated than it needs to be." He turned, mounted, and rode out with his men behind him. The yard went quiet. Eli let out a slow breath somewhere behind them. Ray was looking at Cole. Cole was looking at the gate, May said. "He was expecting you to be alone." Cole glanced at her. "He thought I'd be a distraction," she said. "Something you were managing, instead of something that was standing next to you." She paused. He looked surprised when I walked over. Cole didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Good." The papers came Wednesday morning. Official documents from the county recorder's office, delivered by a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Ray signed for them and brought them to Cole's office, and the three of them, Cole, Ray, and May, who had been doing the household accounts at the other desk and didn't leave when the envelope arrived, read them together. It took a while to get through the legal language, which was dense and constructed, May thought, specifically to discourage people from understanding it. She understood it anyway. The summary. Duval was contesting the western boundary of Whitaker Ranch based on a surveying error from 1871. The original map, he claimed, had a 200-foot discrepancy at the boundary line, directly at the location of the spring. He was asserting that the correct boundary placed the spring on land that was, properly speaking, not Whitaker's. May kept reading. There was a second section. She read it twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. Then she said, quietly, "Cole." He looked over. She pointed to the paragraph. He leaned in and read it. Senator Gerald Holt, through an attorney in Richmond, at a separate legal proceeding. The language was careful and circumspect, and said, in essence, a woman had departed Virginia while under the terms of a pending domestic contract, and he was seeking assistance in ensuring her return. Domestic contract. May set the papers down on the desk. "He's running both at the same time," she said. "Your land and finding me. Duval is doing both." Ray looked at the papers, looked at Cole. The land dispute, I understand. But what does he get out of finding Holt has something Duval wants, Cole said. He was still looking at the papers. Or Duval owes Holt something. Either way, they're working together. May stood up from the desk. She walked to the window and looked out at the yard, at the western hills, at the place where, beyond the ridge, the spring ran clear and cold out of the limestone and made this particular piece of land worth fighting over. He timed it. Huh? She said, until he thought you'd be distracted. Cole was quiet. A new person in the house, May said. An adjustment. He figured you'd be managing. That instead of watching the boundary. He was wrong, Cole said. May turned from the window. He was wrong about what I was going to be. He wasn't wrong about the timing. She looked at Cole. We need a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Thomas Briggs, and his office was above the feed store in Haskell Creek, in a room that smelled like old paper and pipe smoke, and the kind of accumulated patience that comes from 35 years of listening to people's worst problems. He was 60, gray, and had the eyes of a man who had stopped being surprised by human nature sometime around 1860. Cole and May rode in together. The first time they'd gone into town at the same time. People noticed. May noticed them noticing, and kept her face where she always kept it. Briggs read both documents thoroughly. He didn't rush. He set them down, picked them up again, made some notes in the margin of a piece of paper, made some more notes. Finally, he set everything aside and looked at them over his glasses. The boundary dispute, he said. This is winnable. The 1,871 survey error is documented. It's in the county records. The question is whether there's a prior document that establishes the correct boundary before the error was introduced. Your father filed the original deed. Mr. Whitaker, was there a survey done before 1,871? Cole said. There was. 1,868. Briggs looked at him. And the map from that survey. Cole said. I have it. A pause. Briggs said. You have the 1,868 survey map. Where? Bottom drawer of my office desk. Locked. Briggs took his glasses off and cleaned them. He did it slowly, the way men do when they're choosing their next words. Mr. Whitaker, that document is the controlling evidence in this dispute. Why is it in your desk drawer and not filed with the county? Cole said. Because I wasn't in a dispute. I was working my land. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. You are now in a dispute. I know that now. Briggs put his glasses back on. Bring me that map. Today, if you can. I can file a response to Duval's claim and attach it as supporting documentation. And we can freeze his complaint pending the court's review of the original boundary. He turned to May. The other matter, May said. The contract my father agreed to doesn't have my signature on it. I'm aware of that, most likely. But Holt's attorney will argue it's binding under the terms of your father's guardianship. I'm 24, which, in the state of Virginia, under certain interpretations of domestic contract law. Briggs paused. He was clearly choosing his next words with care. The law is not always sensible. Miss Calloway, that's the honest answer. The good news is that the argument they're making is weakest when you appear in court to contradict it yourself. May said, you're telling me I'd need to show up, which means they know where I am. They likely already know where you are, Briggs said. The question is whether you meet this in court or let it run without you. If you let it run without you, they can petition for a compliance order. The room was quiet. May looked at the papers on Briggs's desk, looked at the window, looked at Cole, who was watching her with the same expression he'd had on the road. When Duval rode away, not asking her what she was going to do, not telling her what he thought she should do, just there, present. Then I'll appear, she said, and we need to get that map today. They rode back in the kind of silence that was full rather than empty. Cole went to the office as soon as they got back. May stood in the yard and looked at the western ridge for a moment. then went inside and started supper. 20 minutes later, he came into the kitchen. He set something on the table, a rolled document, old, the edges gone soft with age. May dried her hands and unrolled it carefully. It was a survey map, hand-drawn in ink that had faded to a warm brown, with notations in the tight, precise hand of someone who'd been trained to be accurate. Dated 1868. May looked at the boundary lines, looked at where the spring was marked, looked at the clear, unambiguous line of the western edge of Whitaker property, set well inside of what Duval was now claiming. She looked up. "This wins it," she said. Briggs seemed to think so. "Why didn't you?" She stopped herself. Cole said, "Why didn't I file it?" "I wasn't going to ask that." "You were thinking it." She was thinking it. She looked at the map and then at him. "Why didn't you?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Because I didn't know it mattered," he said. "My father kept it. I found it when he passed. I knew what it was. I didn't think I needed it, because I wasn't arguing with anyone about my land. I was working it." May thought about that. "Duval's been building toward this for 2 years," she said. "Buying the land around yours, piece by piece, waiting until he had enough pressure to make a real claim." "Yes, and he figured you either wouldn't have the prior survey or wouldn't know to use it," Cole said. "He figured wrong. He figured wrong." May agreed. She rolled the map carefully and held it out to him. He took it, and their hands were close for a moment, the map between them, and neither of them moved particularly fast. Then he stood up. "I'll get this to Briggs first thing tomorrow," he said. He was almost to the door when May said, "Cole." He stopped. She'd been turning this over since the ride home, deciding whether to say it, and deciding in the end that not saying things because they were uncomfortable was a habit she didn't want to keep. "He timed this for when he thought you'd be distracted," she said. "By me. By the adjustment of someone new in the house." Cole turned around. "I know. I want to make sure you know that I know it too. That I understand what I've brought to this situation by being here." Cole looked at her from across the kitchen, steady, patient, in the way of a man who has considered something thoroughly before speaking. "Duval wanted this land before you ever set foot in Texas," he said. "He would have found his moment with or without you. Don't take on responsibility for what someone else decided to do." A pause. "That's not yours to carry." May held his gaze. It was a simple thing to say. Short, plain, nothing elaborate about it. She'd heard a lot of words in her life directed at the subject of what was and wasn't her fault, and most of them had been longer and more complicated than that. None of them had landed the way those did. "All right," she said. He nodded and went to put the map in the locked drawer, where it would stay safe until morning. May went back to the stove. Outside, the evening light was doing its particular thing over the limestone hills, going gold, and then going rose, and then going the kind of pale gray that meant the day was finishing. The cedar brakes stood dark against it. The spring ran somewhere on the other side of the ridge, invisible from here, but there, the way important things often were. She stirred the pot and thought about a man who'd said, "Don't carry what isn't yours," like it was the most obvious truth in the world. She thought she was going to have to get used to that, the way a person gets used to things. They hadn't known they were missing. The fire started sometime after midnight. May woke to the smell of it first, then the sound, that low, unnatural roar that fire makes when it's found enough to eat. She was at the window before she was fully awake, and the secondary barn was already going. Orange light pouring through the gaps in the boards, the whole south wall breathing flame. She pulled on her boots and ran. Cole was already there. Ray, too, and Eli, and two of the other hands. Everyone shouting and moving in the particular controlled chaos of people who know what needs doing first. The horses. Get the horses out. Everything else was replaceable. The horses weren't. May went in through the side door and took the nearest stall, and got a mare named Duchess out into the yard, while the smoke squawk was low enough to breathe. She went back for another. Cole was on the far end, doing the same, working fast and quiet, talking to the animals the way he always did. They got every horse out. The barn went anyway. They stood in the yard in the early hours of the morning and watched it finish burning. Nothing to be done by then except make sure the fire didn't spread to the hay stores. It didn't. The night air was still, and the summer had been wet enough that the ground between buildings wasn't tinder. When the last of the structural beams came down in a shower of orange sparks, the yard went quiet. Ray crouched near the ash line at first light and found it, a piece of cloth, white with a dark border, the kind of handkerchief a man wore in a city when he wanted to look like he came from somewhere. He brought it to Cole without a word. Cole looked at it. He didn't say anything either. He handed it back to Ray and walked to the house. May found him in the kitchen an hour later. She came in from outside, still carrying the smell of smoke in her hair, and she said what she'd been turning over since the fire started. "This is my fault," she said, "if I weren't here." "Duval wouldn't have stopped," Cole said. He was standing at the stove. He turned around and looked at her directly. "Duval wanted this land before you ever came to Texas," he said. "He was going to find his moment regardless. You didn't cause this." "He did," he held her gaze. "Don't carry what belongs to someone else. That's not yours." May stood in the kitchen doorway with smoke in her hair and looked at this man who kept saying that like it was simple. Maybe it was simple. Maybe she'd just never heard anyone say it plainly before. Holt arrived in Haskell Creek on a Thursday. He didn't come to the ranch. He sent a rider instead, a young attorney in a good coat, who knocked on the door and handed Ray an envelope with the controlled pleasantness of someone doing a job he had decided not to have feelings about. May read the letter at the kitchen table. Cole stood beside her. It was written in the language of legal documents, which is a language designed to make ordinary things sound inevitable. It spoke of obligations and contracts and the duties owed by a daughter to her family's standing. It did not once use the word want. It used the word require. I folded it. "He thinks if he calls it an obligation, it sounds like something I agreed to," she said. Cole said, "Does it?" "No." She set the letter on the table. "It's still just him wanting something I haven't consented to give." She looked at Cole. "I need to appear in court. Briggs said that's the only way to end this properly. Once I do, it's over the claim, has no standing without a signed contract. And I never signed it." Cole said, "Then we go to court." May said, "He'll know where I am." "He already knows where you are." She looked at him. "He's known since Duval found you." Cole said, "Appearing in court doesn't give him anything he doesn't already have. It just takes away his argument." May thought about that. "All right," she said. 2 days later, Holt's men started appearing on the road, not doing anything. Just there. 2 riders, sometimes 3, stationed at the road's edge in sight of the front gate, watching. It was a pressure tactic, and a simple one, the message being that someone was always watching. That comfort was a temporary condition. Eli wanted to ride out and say something to them. Cole said no. "That's what they want," he said. "They want a confrontation they can use. We don't give them one." But on the 3rd morning, one of them rode through the gate, came 20 yards onto Whitaker property without cause or invitation, just to demonstrate that he could. Cole saddled Ranger. He rode out slowly, with Ray and Eli falling in behind him. Not asked to, just there. He stopped Ranger 10 feet from the rider and looked at him without hurry. "You're on private property," Cole said. "I'm asking you once to step back." The man looked at him, looked at Ray, looked at Eli, did the math. He rode back to the road. May had watched from the porch steps. She'd watched Cole ride out calm as weather. No rifle drawn, no threat made that wasn't already contained in the way he sat the horse and the way he spoke. When he came back, he found her still on the steps. He looked at her. The look asked if she was all right. She nodded once. They went inside. That evening, Ray sat down across from May at the kitchen table. After Cole had gone to bed, he had his hat in his hands and the look of a man who'd made a decision. "I'm going to tell you something," he said. "Not so you'll feel sorry for him. He won't stand for that. But because I think you need to understand what you're actually looking at." May waited. Ray told her about the night Sarah died. He told it plainly. The way a man tells a hard story when he's done with the part where it still surprises him. Cole had ridden 14 hours in a storm to find the nearest doctor. The doctor was 20 miles away, over roads that weren't roads in the rain. Cole had pushed Ranger harder than he'd ever pushed any horse in his life, and he'd still come home 2 hours after Sarah was gone. No one had been with her. He'd been 15 minutes from the house when she'd first showed signs. 15 minutes. He's been living inside those 15 minutes for 3 years, Ray said. "I've told him 100 times that the doctor couldn't have made it back in time regardless. He doesn't hear it, or he hears it, and he doesn't believe it. There's a difference." Ray turned his hat once in his hands. "I thought you should know." After Ray went to bed, May sat at the table for a long time. Then she walked to Cole's office. The door was open. He was at the desk with a book he wasn't reading. "Cole," she said. He looked up. 15 minutes didn't cost you, Sarah," she said. "You know that somewhere. Even if you can't get to it yet, I'm not going to keep saying it. But it needed to be said once, clearly, by someone who isn't going to walk away from you after saying it." She turned and went to her room. She heard him, a long time later, get up from the desk. She heard the back door open. She heard it close. She didn't see him again until morning. He came in from the yard with a quietness about him that was different from his usual quiet, harder to describe. The way a room feels after a window's been opened, even after the window is closed again. He poured coffee, sat down. He looked at her across the table. "Thank you," he said. May said, "You don't have to thank me for telling the truth." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face that she'd been watching change, week by week, shifting again. "No," he said, "I suppose I don't." He picked up his cup. Outside, the morning light was doing its thing over the limestone hills. The morning of the hearing. May came downstairs to find the yard full of people. Not just the ranch hands, the workers' families too. Clara Brooks, with her new husband, standing beside her. Several of the families from the Sunday school, parents she'd only met in passing, standing in the early light with their hats off, and their children beside them. Nobody had called a meeting. They were just there. Eli stepped forward when Cole and May came out. "We're riding with you," he said. That was all. Cole stood in the yard and looked at the assembled people, the faces he'd known for years, the faces he'd only recently come to know, all of them standing together in the particular way of people who have made a decision and are done deliberating about it. Something moved through Cole's face. It moved fast, and he kept it quiet, but May was close enough to see it. Clara found a moment beside May while Cole was speaking to Ray. "You built something here without realizing it," she said. "That's what you do. You show up as yourself, every day, and people decide to stand with you." May looked at the yard full of people. She thought about $14 in one bag. She thought about her mother's voice. "You don't need anyone's permission to exist." "Let's go," Cole said. The courthouse in Haskell Creek smelled like old wood and lamp oil, and the dry, particular smell of documents stored in an airless room. Judge Harlan presided. He was somewhere north of 60, with the economy of movement of a man who'd been doing this long enough to know that most of what happened in his courtroom came down to paper and patience. Briggs presented the land case first. He laid it out clearly, and without theater, the 1,868 survey map, the documented error in the 1,871 filing, the sequence of Duval's land purchases made after he would have had access to both maps. The argument was simple. Duval knew what he was claiming wasn't legitimate before he filed the claim. Duval's attorney argued back. Briggs answered. The judge listened and made notes. Then Holt's attorney stood up. He had a smooth way about him, practiced and unhurried. He argued that Cole Whitaker had harbored a woman in breach of a domestic contract, that the ranch itself was therefore party to the matter, and that the court should take this into account when considering the totality of the case. It was a clever move. May saw it for what it was immediately, an attempt to contaminate Cole's credibility in the land case by attaching him to her situation. Duval, 2 rows back, was watching with the expression of a man waiting for a clock to finish. May stood up. "Your Honor," she said. The judge looked at her. "Miss Calloway, you're not. I'm the party Senator Holt is referencing," she said. "I'd like to address his attorney's representation directly, if the court will allow it." The judge nodded once. She didn't look at Duval. She didn't look at Holt, who was sitting in the 2nd row with his attorney. She looked at the judge, because the judge was the person who mattered right now. And she spoke the way she used to speak to students clearly, without rushing, making sure every word landed before she moved to the next one. "My name is May Calloway. I came to Texas by my own decision, on a ticket I bought with my own money. I am employed at Whitaker Ranch under a legitimate agreement at a fair wage. The domestic contract Senator Holt is referencing, I did not sign it. My father signed it, and I would ask the court to consider what it means to enforce an agreement made about a person without that person's knowledge or consent." She paused. "I am not a piece of property that was misplaced. I am a woman who made a choice. If the court needs documentation, I wrote a letter to my father on the morning I left Virginia, stating my refusal clearly. I kept a copy." She set the letter on Briggs's table. The room was very quiet. Holt's attorney leaned over to his client and said something low. Holt looked at May. She looked back at him steady. No anger, no triumph. Just looking. He sat back. He had nothing left to work with. Cole was beside her when she sat down. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at her with any particular expression. But under the table, his hand found hers and stayed there. She didn't look down. She looked at Judge Harlan and waited. The judge found for Whitaker on the boundary matter. The 1,868 map was clear. The 1,871 error was documented. Duval's claim was dismissed. On the Holt matter, no valid contract, no legal standing. Dismissed. Duval stood when the rulings were read. He looked at Cole, looked at May, looked at the 2 full rows of Whitaker Ranch people sitting behind them. Then he walked out without speaking to anyone. Holt looked at May before he left. It was not the look she'd braced for, not anger. It was the look of a man who had, very late, and at considerable personal cost, understood something he should have understood long ago. She didn't know exactly what. She didn't need to. She just looked back at him, and after a moment, he turned and walked out ahead of her. Outside the courthouse, the whole ranch was waiting. Clara hugged her with both arms, fiercely, the way Clara did most things. Eli shook Cole's hand, and then seemed to think that wasn't enough, and shook it again. Ray stood back and looked at Cole with the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time to see something, and was now seeing it. On the ride home, May and Cole sat close on the wagon seat. The urgency was gone. The weight of the last several weeks, the papers, the fire, Holt's men on the road, the preparation had lifted. And what was left underneath was something lighter. After a while, Cole said, "When did you write that letter?" "The one you brought to court, the morning I left Richmond," May said. "I knew he'd come eventually. I wanted to be ready." "You left with $14 and a bag." $14, a bag, and a letter. She glanced at him. "Don't forget the letter." Cole laughed. Not the brief, controlled exhale she'd heard from him once or twice before. He actually laughed, from somewhere deeper, lasting longer. The sound of a man setting down something he'd been carrying for a very long time, and only now feeling the weight leave his hands. May had to look out at the road, because she didn't want him to see her face while he sounded like that. After a while, she looked back. He was still smiling. Just barely. Just enough, she thought. There he is, that evening. The whole ranch ate supper outdoors. Someone found a long table, and another was pulled from the bunkhouse, and they pushed them together, and the families brought food, and the hands brought what they had, and it became the kind of meal that doesn't get planned, only arrived at. Rosa climbed into May's lap partway through and fell asleep before the dessert came out. May didn't move. She sat with the warm weight of the sleeping child and looked down the table at the faces of people she hadn't known 3 months ago and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. At the head of the table, Cole was listening to Ray tell a story about something that had happened with a supply shipment 3 years back. He was half smiling, which on Cole was the equivalent of most men laughing outright. He glanced down the table, found May, found Rosa asleep in her lap. He looked for a moment longer than necessary. Ray leaned close to him and said something very quietly. Cole looked down at his plate. Then he looked back at May. The next morning, May heard the second cup being poured. She was already in the kitchen when Cole came downstairs. She'd been up since before the sun. She'd made coffee, and she'd made enough for two, the way she always did. Though usually she drank hers alone in the kitchen, while Cole had his alone on the porch. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. She was at the window, watching the sky go from gray to pale gold over the hills. Then she heard the chair at the kitchen table. She turned around. Cole was sitting down, with his coffee, at the table, looking at her like he was exactly where he meant to be. May sat down across from him. They drank their coffee in the kitchen together, while the morning came in through the window and the ranch woke up outside. Neither of them said anything for a while. They didn't need to. After breakfast, Ray and Eli went out to the south pasture. The house went quiet around them. Cole stood at the back door, looking out over the property. May washed up at the basin. Cole said, "Winter's going to be hard. Briggs says the barn roof needs work before October." "I know. I put it in the supply budget for next month." Silence. "I don't need you to go anywhere," Cole said. May kept her hands in the basin. "What did you say?" He turned from the door. He looked at her directly, the way he'd been slowly learning to look at things without sideways approaches, without managing it from a distance. "I don't want you to think of this as somewhere you're staying for now. I want you to think of it as yours." May dried her hands. She didn't turn around right away. She stood at the basin and breathed. Then she turned. "Cole, do you understand what you're saying?" "I think so. Say it clearly." I've spent too much of my life listening to things said sideways. I'm not good at guessing anymore." He held her gaze. He didn't look away. "I wake up every morning, and the first thing I want to know is whether you're still here. I make decisions about this ranch, and I want your thinking on them. I've slept since you came, not because the house is quieter, but because it isn't empty anymore." A pause. "I don't know if you want to stay. I only know I want to ask." May was quiet for a long moment. "Are you asking, or are you telling?" He considered it. "Both." She looked at him, at this man who had fixed her window latch without mentioning it, who had taught children to read in a barn on Sunday mornings because he thought they deserved to know how, who had stood in the rain with a frightened horse for an hour because he couldn't leave it alone in that. Then the answer to both is, "I decided to stay 2 months ago," she said. "You're only just now catching up." He crossed the kitchen. No rush. The way he did everything. He stopped in front of her and looked at her, and she looked back. May Cole. That was all either of them needed. 3 days later, May passed the old tack barn and found the door open. She went in. Cole was on the floor with the small wooden cradle in front of him, a rag in his hand, working the oil into the wood slowly. The wood was coming back, darkening, smoothing, beginning to look like what it had always been underneath the years. May sat down beside him on the floor without being asked. They looked at the cradle together. "Wood still good," Cole said. "It'll hold." It will, May said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The story of the child who'd never lain in this cradle wasn't over it, would never be over, and neither of them would ask it to be. But it was no longer the only thing in the room. There was room for it, and room for other things too, and that was different from how it had been. Cole picked up the cradle and carried it outside. He set it on the back porch, in the long afternoon light that came over the limestone hills at this particular hour, and went gold before it, went rose before it went the gray of evening. Sarah's light, the light she'd said, was different from any other place in the world. He set the cradle down gently. He stood and looked at it for a moment. May came and stood beside him, and they looked at it together in the good light. She was right about the light, he thought. She was right about that. 5 years later, 1,887. 2 cups on the back porch railing. One where it had always been. One where it had been every morning for 5 years. The ranch was larger now. The spring still ran on the western edge of Whitaker property, and its water was shared by agreement with 3 neighboring families who couldn't make it through the dry seasons alone. May had suggested it. Cole had negotiated the terms. Nobody called it charity. Nobody called it anything except a fair arrangement between neighbors. The old tack barn had a sign above the door, now hand-painted by Eli. Haskell Creek Learning Room. May taught mornings. Cole taught afternoons. Eli, 26, and, working toward his teaching certificate, taught evenings. Rosa was 11 and read better than most of the adults in town. Inside the house, a 3-year-old named Sam was still sleeping. A second child was expected in the spring. The cradle was on the porch in the afternoon light. Sam napped in it most days, in the golden slant that came over the hills at this particular hour. Oh, Cole looked at it every afternoon and thought about Sarah. He always would. That was right. That was how it should be. May watched him look at it and knew what he was thinking. And she put her hand on his, the way she did without planning to, the way it had become as natural as anything in her life. He turned his hand over and held hers. May Calloway came to Haskell Creek with $14, 1 bag, and a letter she kept like a last line of defense. She came running from something. She stayed because she found something she hadn't known to look for. Cole Whitaker spent 3 years living inside 15 minutes. He couldn't forgive himself for until a woman arrived and showed him, without making it a lesson, that forgiving yourself isn't forgetting. It's just choosing to keep going. They didn't build what they have from anything perfect. They built it from honesty, when honesty was uncomfortable. From respect, when control would have been easier. From showing up every ordinary day, until the ordinary days became a life. That wasn't luck. It wasn't fate written into the Texas sky. It was 2 people choosing each other not once, but every day, in the small, deliberate ways that people choose the things that actually matter to them. And that is the only way love that lasts has ever been built. May Calloway arrived in Haskell Creek carrying only $14, 1 bag, and the belief that her life still belonged to her. She had no guarantee of safety, no powerful name protecting her, and no clear plan for what would happen next. Yet she understood something that the men trying to control her had never understood. A human being is not a debt to be paid, a contract to be transferred, or a possession to be returned. Her father could make an agreement. Gerald Holt could hire attorneys. Preston Duval could use wealth, influence, and fear. But none of them could honestly claim the one thing that mattered most: May's consent. When May stood before the court and declared that she was not a piece of property that had been misplaced, she was speaking for more than herself. She was speaking for every person who has ever been told that duty matters more than dignity, that obedience matters more than freedom, or that someone else has the right to determine the boundaries of their life. Her victory did not come because somebody rescued her before she could speak. It came because she found the strength to stand, tell the truth, and make the court see her not as somebody S. daughter, somebody S. promised bride, or somebody S. responsibility, but as a woman with a mind, a voice, and a will of her own. Cole's journey teaches us a different but equally powerful lesson. For 3 years, he lived as though grief were a sentence he had to serve alone. He locked away Sarah S. room, hid the cradle, and reduced his life to work, silence, and survival. He believed that moving forward might somehow dishonor the woman and child he had lost. But grief does not ask us to erase the past, and healing does not require us to stop loving those who are gone. Healing means learning that the heart can carry sorrow and hope at the same time. It means understanding that making room for tomorrow does not destroy yesterday. May never demanded that Cole forget Sarah. She did not force open the locked door, question him before he was ready, or try to replace what had been lost. She simply stayed. She cooked meals, restored the garden, taught the children, held a lamp during the storm, and sat beside him in the morning silence. Through those small acts, she showed him that compassion does not always need a speech. Sometimes it looks like a repaired window latch. Sometimes it is an extra plate of biscuits. Sometimes it is sitting beside someone without asking them to explain the pain they are still learning how to carry. That is one of the deepest lessons of this story. Real love does not control. It does not demand, rush, threaten, or take. It listens. It respects boundaries. It gives the other person room to choose. Cole offered May a room with a lock on the door before he knew the full truth of her past. When she finally told him what she was running from, he did not claim ownership of her problem or decide her future for her. He simply reminded her that she had come to the ranch by her own choice, and that nobody had the right to drag her away from the life she had chosen. Their love was not created in one dramatic moment. It grew in the spaces between words. It grew through shared work, honest disagreement, patience, and trust earned one day at a time. That is why it lasted. Love that depends only on excitement may disappear when hardship arrives. But love built from respect becomes stronger under pressure because both people know they're standing together without either one being made smaller. The story also reminds us that knowledge is a form of protection. Cole and May taught the ranch children to read because they understood that ignorance is often used as a weapon by those who hold power. A person who cannot read a contract must trust someone else to explain it. A person who cannot understand the law may surrender rights they never knew they possessed. Teaching those children was not merely an act of kindness. It was an act of freedom. Every letter Rosa learned gave her another tool with which to defend her future. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, or situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.